When I was just a child 6 or 7 years old, my life changed forever the day my mother remarried. It wasn't just the fact that she brought Nick into our lives. It was the way everything seemed to shift so drastically, as if I had been erased from existence. At first, I thought having another parent around might fill some of the void left by my father's absence. How naive I was. What followed was a nightmare I could never have imagined, a relentless cycle of neglect, cruelty, and betrayal at the hands of someone who should have been my brother. Nick came with baggage. His son, Ben, 6 years older than me and already carrying an air of entitlement. From the moment they moved in, I felt invisible. The day they officially became part of our household is seared into my memory. My mother buzzed around like a queen bee, hanging family photos on the walls while Nick and Ben unpacked their belongings. But when I looked closer at those pictures later that evening, my heart sank. Not one single photo included me. It wasn't just oversight, it was deliberate exclusion. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me hollow and confused. Was this what family meant now, a collection of memories where I didn't belong? But the worst was yet to come. Ben made it clear from the start that I wasn't welcome. His actions weren't subtle, they were calculated, designed to make me feel small, insignificant, disposable. One of the most devastating moments happened when he destroyed something irreplaceable, the last letter my father ever wrote to me. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a lifeline to the man I barely remembered but desperately missed. I kept it hidden under my mattress, a sacred relic of love and connection. Somehow Ben found it, and then, one afternoon, I returned home to find him standing in the backyard, laughing as flames consumed the only tangible reminder of my father. "Ups," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Guess you won't miss this anymore." I wanted to scream, to cry, to fight back, but I froze, paralyzed by grief and rage. When I ran to tell my mother, hoping for justice, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "It's just a letter," she said coldly. "Stop making such a fuss." As if destroying my keepsakes wasn't enough, Ben took pleasure in tormenting me physically and emotionally. There was the night during a violent storm when he locked me outside in the pouring rain. I still remember the sound of thunder cracking overhead, the icy water soaking through my clothes as I pounded on the door, begging to be let in. Inside, I could see the warm glow of lights and hear laughter echoing from the living room. My mother and Nick sat there, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to my plight. For hours, I huddled beneath the porch, shivering and crying, feeling utterly abandoned. No one came to check on me. No one cared. School became another battleground, thanks to Ben's manipulative schemes. Once, he offered to help me with my math homework, pretending to be the supportive older sibling I wished he could be. Eager for any scrap of kindness, I trusted him completely. Little did I know, he filled my answers with deliberate mistakes, ensuring I'd fail miserably. The next day, my teacher called me to the front of the class, holding up my worksheet like evidence of incompetence. "How could you get every single question wrong?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disappointment. My cheeks burned with shame as my classmates snickered. When I tried to explain that Ben had tampered with my work, no one believed me, not even my mother, who simply rolled her eyes and muttered, "You're always blaming others for your failures." Every day felt like walking on eggshells, never knowing when Ben would strike next. He thrived on chaos, feeding off my fear and vulnerability. Whether it was stealing my favorite toys, spreading lies about me at school, or sabotaging my projects, he made sure I understood one thing: I was expendable. Meanwhile, my mother turned a blind eye to his cruelty, treating him like the golden child while relegating me to the shadows. She praised his achievements, celebrated his milestones, and lavished him with attention, all while I faded further into the background. It wasn't just favoritism, it was outright neglect. Looking back, I realize how deeply these experiences shaped me. They taught me to question my worth, to internalize the belief that I wasn't good enough. Every insult, every act of sabotage chipped away at my self-esteem until I began to wonder if maybe Ben was right, if maybe I truly deserved to be treated this way. But deep down, a spark of defiance remained. Even as a child, I knew something was profoundly wrong. I couldn't articulate it then, but I understand now. I was fighting not just against Ben, but against a system that prioritized him over me at every turn. The tension between my mother and me wasn't something that developed overnight. It was a slow, suffocating buildup of neglect, favoritism, and outright cruelty. Each moment added another brick to the wall she had been constructing around me since Nick and Ben entered our lives. But there were certain incidents that stood out like jagged scars, moments so deeply etched into my memory that they still haunt me even now. One such incident happened during a family gathering, a rare occasion where everyone on both sides of the family came together for dinner at our house. The air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of roasted chicken wafting through the rooms. For once, I thought maybe things would be different. Maybe this time, I could blend in without feeling like an outsider in my own home. How wrong I was. As the evening wore on, conversations turned to achievements: Ben's latest soccer trophy, his academic accolades, and how proud everyone was of him. That's when it happened. My mother, standing near the dining table with a glass of wine in hand, looked directly at me and said, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear, "Honestly, my daughter isn't good enough to compare with Ben." The room seemed to freeze. Conversations halted mid-sentence as all eyes turned toward me. Some relatives exchanged awkward glances, others smirked behind their napkins. I felt my cheeks burn as if someone had slapped me across the face. Her words weren't just a casual remark, they were a deliberate dagger aimed straight at my heart. She didn't care about sparing my feelings or protecting me from public humiliation. No. Her goal was clear: to remind everyone present, and especially me, that I was nothing compared to her golden child, Ben. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the floorboards beneath me. Instead, I forced a tight smile, excused myself, and retreated to my bedroom, where I cried silently into my pillow. It wasn't the first time she made me feel worthless, but it was one of the most brutal examples of her disdain. But that wasn't the only way she drove the point home. There were countless small indignities designed to reinforce her preference for Ben over me. Take clothing, for instance. While Ben strutted around in designer jeans and expensive sneakers, I was forced to wear second-hand clothes, or worse, outfits my mother bought on clearance racks because they were good enough for me. One particular outfit stands out vividly in my mind: a faded floral dress with frayed edges and a stain near the hem that no amount of scrubbing could remove. When I hesitated to put it on before church one Sunday, she snapped at me. "What's wrong with it? You should be grateful you have anything at all." She spat, her voice sharp and dismissive. Meanwhile, Ben lounged on the couch in a brand new polo shirt and khakis, looking every bit the prince of the household, while I shuffled uncomfortably in my rags. The contrast was glaring, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. And then there was the time I fell ill, a fever so high that I could barely lift my head off the pillow. My body ached, my throat burned, and every breath felt like swallowing fire. I called out weakly for help, hoping someone would bring me water or check my temperature. But instead of staying by my side, my mother chose that exact moment to prioritize Ben yet again. He had a regional soccer tournament that weekend, and missing it simply wasn't an option. "You'll be fine," she said curtly, barely glancing at me as she packed snacks and bottled water for Ben's trip. "Just rest and drink plenty of fluids." With those hollow words, she left me alone in the house, shivering under thin blankets while she cheered him on from the sidelines miles away. Hours passed in silence, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the relentless ticking of the clock. Every cough rattled my chest, every movement sent waves of dizziness crashing over me. I tried calling my grandparents, desperate for some semblance of comfort, but they were out of town visiting friends. For hours, I lay there, abandoned and forgotten, wondering what I had done to deserve such treatment. Was I truly so unworthy of love and care? The fever eventually broke late that night, leaving me exhausted and emotionally drained, but the damage was done. That day cemented something inside me, a realization that no matter how sick, sad, or scared I might be, I would always come second, or worse, last in her eyes. These moments weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of emotional abuse and neglect. Every interaction with my mother carried the weight of unspoken resentment. She saw me not as her daughter but as a constant reminder of a past she despised, a connection to my father, whose mistakes she blamed for everything wrong in her life. Whenever she looked at me, I knew she wasn't seeing me, she was seeing him. And because of that, I became collateral damage in her war against her own memories. Even as these events unfolded, Ben reveled in his elevated status. He wasn't shy about rubbing salt into my wounds either. On the rare occasions when he deigned to acknowledge my existence, it was often to mock me further. After the infamous family dinner debacle, he cornered me in the hallway, grinning smugly. "Guess Mom's right," he sneered. "You really aren't cut out for much, are you?" His words stung, but what hurt more was knowing he believed the man worse, that my mother had given him permission to believe them. Looking back, I can see how these experiences shaped me. They taught me to question my worth, to internalize the belief that I wasn't enough, not smart enough, not talented enough, not worthy enough. But buried beneath the pain was a flicker of defiance. Deep down, I knew the truth. None of this was my fault. I hadn't asked to be born into this dysfunctional mess, and I certainly hadn't earned the disdain poured upon me daily. Yet surviving it required strength I didn't know I possessed. Each insult, each act of neglect, chipped away at my spirit, but it also fueled a quiet determination to prove them wrong. The love I received from my grandparents was the only lifeline that kept me afloat in an ocean of neglect and cruelty. They were my sanctuary, the people who saw me for who I truly was, a child desperate for affection and validation. But even their unconditional support came at a cost, one that exposed the deep fractures within my family dynamic. One of the most poignant moments happened when I discovered something they had done behind everyone's back, something so selfless it made my heart ache with gratitude but also ignited a storm of conflict. Unbeknownst to me, my grandparents had been secretly saving money for years, not just to help with everyday expenses but to secure a scholarship fund for my education. It wasn't much by societal standards, but to them, it was everything, a testament to their belief in my potential and their desire to give me a future free from the chains of poverty and resentment. When my mother found out about this, her reaction was nothing short of volcanic. She stormed into their house one evening, her face flushed with anger, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "How dare you interfere with how I raise my child?" she spat, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "You think you know better than me. This is my family, my rules." My grandfather, usually calm and composed, stood his ground. His voice trembled slightly, but his resolve never wavered. "We're doing this because we care about her," he said firmly. "Because someone has to." Those words hung heavy in the air, a silent indictment of my mother's failures as a parent. The argument escalated until my grandmother, tears streaming down her face, begged them to stop. But the damage was done. From that day forward, my mother treated my grandparents with icy disdain, accusing them of undermining her authority every chance she got. Despite the tension, my grandparents continued to shield me from the worst of it. They would pick me up on weekends, taking me to their cozy little home where laughter replaced silence, and warmth chased away the coldness I felt at my own house. One particular visit stands out vividly in my memory, a day that should have been filled with joy but instead became another example of how unfairly I was treated. It started innocently enough. We were sitting around the dining table after lunch, playing cards and laughing. For once, I allowed myself to relax, to forget about the constant weight pressing down on my shoulders. Ben, however, had other plans. He showed up uninvited, barging into the house without so much as a knock. At first, I thought maybe he'd come to apologize for all the years of torment or at least pretend to be civil. Instead, he sauntered into the room, his lips curled into a sneer, and deliberately knocked over the dining table. Glasses shattered, plates clattered to the floor, and food spilled everywhere. My grandmother gasped, clutching her chest as if the shock might overwhelm her frail body. My grandfather immediately sprang into action, trying to clean up the mess while casting worried glances at my grandmother. Meanwhile, Ben stood there smirking, arms crossed, as if daring anyone to challenge him. And then, predictably, my mother arrived, not to reprimand Ben, but to blame me. "Why can't you keep things under control?" she snapped, glaring at me as though I were the one responsible for the chaos. "This wouldn't have happened if you weren't always causing trouble." I stared at her, stunned into silence. How could she twist reality so effortlessly? How could she look past Ben's blatant provocation and pin the fault squarely on me? My throat tightened, choking back the sobs threatening to escape. My grandparents exchanged a glance, their faces etched with sorrow and frustration. They wanted to defend me, I could see it in their eyes, but they knew better than to argue with her. Doing so would only make things worse, and they couldn't risk losing what little access they still had to me. That incident left a scar deeper than any physical wound. It wasn't just the broken glass or the ruined meal. It was the realization that no matter what I did, I would always be the scapegoat. My mother's inability or unwillingness to see the truth was suffocating. Even in the presence of witnesses, she refused to hold Ben accountable. To her, I was expendable, a reminder of a past she despised, while Ben was untouchable, the golden child whose actions were excused no matter how destructive they were. But despite these betrayals, my grandparents remained steadfast. They didn't let my mother's hostility deter them from showing me love and support. On the drive home that evening, my grandfather reached over and patted my knee. "Don't listen to her," he said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling around us. "You're not what she says you are. You're strong, smart, and capable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." His words were a balm to my wounded soul, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. As time went on, I began to understand the depth of their sacrifice. Every penny they saved, every late-night conversation they had about my future, every moment they spent shielding me from my mother's wrath, it all added up to something greater than themselves. Their love wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, enduring, and unwavering, and yet it came at a price. The rift between them and my mother grew wider with each passing year, a chasm too vast to bridge. But they bore it silently, choosing to prioritize my well-being over their own comfort. Looking back, I realize how much they risked for me. They defied my mother's wishes, stood up to her rage, and endured her accusations, all because they believed in me. In a world where I often felt invisible, they made sure I knew I mattered. Their home became my refuge, a place where I could shed the armor I wore daily and simply exist as myself. Without them, I don't know if I would have survived the relentless onslaught of neglect and abuse. Even now, years later, I carry their lessons with me. Their courage inspires me to stand firm in the face of adversity, to protect my boundaries no matter the cost. Though they are no longer here physically, their legacy lives on in the choices I make and the person I strive to become. They taught me that true family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by love, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for those who need it most. The tension between Ben and me had always been a simmering pot, ready to boil over at any moment. But when he re-entered my life as an adult, the conflict escalated into something far more sinister than I could have imagined. It wasn't just about childhood bullying or sibling rivalry anymore, it was about power, control, and revenge. It all started with that unexpected message from Ben on social media. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a casual inquiry about how I'd been doing, followed by vague updates about his own struggles. But soon, the tone shifted. He revealed that he and his family were facing eviction and desperately needed a place to stay. "Your house is perfect," he wrote, almost too casually, as if he hadn't spent years treating me like dirt. "We'll stay out of your way." I should have known better than to trust him. My gut screamed no, but part of me hesitated. Maybe he's changed, I thought. Maybe this is his way of making amends, but deep down, I knew better. This was Ben, the same person who once tormented me relentlessly, who destroyed my belongings, and who made my childhood a living nightmare. And yet, there was still a flicker of hope that perhaps adulthood had softened him. When I politely declined, explaining that our history made it impossible for me to feel comfortable hosting him, his response came swiftly and violently. "You're really going to hold grudges after all these years?" he demanded, his words dripping with accusation. Then came the threats. "If you refuse to help, maybe we'll have to take legal action. After all, you inherited Grandma and Grandpa's house without sharing anything with the rest of us." My blood ran cold. Legal action? Was he serious? The audacity of his claim was staggering. Our grandparents had left everything to me not because they favored me unfairly, but because they saw how much I needed their support. They sacrificed so I could build a stable life, while Ben enjoyed every privilege growing up. Yet here he was, trying to twist reality to suit his narrative, painting himself as the victim and me as the selfish and great. But the harassment didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening. Late at night, I'd receive anonymous text messages filled with cryptic warnings. "You can't ignore family forever," one read. Another said, "People who turn their backs on loved ones always regret it." Each message sent chills down my spine, leaving me paranoid and restless. Who was behind them? Was it Ben, or someone else in the family rallying to his cause? Then came the incidents outside my home. One morning, I discovered my car vandalized, scratches running along the side panels, the tires slashed. A note taped to the windshield read, "Family sticks together." Fear gripped me like a vice. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked even. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow passing my window, felt like a potential threat. For weeks, I lived in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, unable to sleep through the night. And then, one fateful evening, the situation reached its breaking point. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard loud banging on my front door. Startled, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the peephole, I saw him, Ben, standing there swaying unsteadily, clearly intoxicated. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with anger. "Open the damn door," he shouted, slamming his fist against the wood. "You think you can shut me out? This is family property, you owe me." Panic surged through me. What if he broke in? What if he hurt me? I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling so badly I could barely press the numbers. Meanwhile, Ben continued his tirade, shouting obscenities and accusations loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "You're nothing but a spoiled brat," he roared. "Grandma and Grandpa would be ashamed of you." The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until two officers stepped out of their patrol car. By then, Ben had calmed down slightly, though his demeanor remained belligerent. When the officers questioned him, he tried to play the victim, claiming I was refusing to help my struggling brother. But the evidence spoke for itself: his drunken state, the vandalism, the threatening messages. The officers warned him to leave immediately and not return, or else face arrest. As they escorted him away, I collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew this wasn't the end. Ben wouldn't give up that easily. He thrived on chaos, on manipulation, and on exploiting others' guilt. And now, he had declared war not just against me, but against the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. In the days that followed, I fortified my defenses. I installed security cameras around the perimeter of my house, upgraded the locks, and joined a local self-defense class. I also sought legal advice, ensuring that I had documentation proving the inheritance was legitimate and untouchable. Every precaution felt necessary, given the lengths Ben seemed willing to go to undermine me. Despite these measures, fear lingered. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, questioning whether I'd ever truly escape his wrath. Friends and acquaintances noticed the change in me: the nervous glances, the jumpiness, the exhaustion etched into my features. Some offered support, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Others, however, subtly suggested I reconsider my stance, implying that maybe I was being too harsh. But I refused to back down. After everything I'd endured, years of neglect, emotional abuse, and betrayal, I deserved peace. I owed it to myself to protect the sanctuary I had built, the only safe haven I'd ever known. If standing firm meant losing what little connection I had left with my biological family, then so be it. Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. And Ben, he represented none of those things. I realized that this confrontation marked a turning point in my journey toward healing. It forced me to confront the lingering fears and insecurities planted during my childhood. It reminded me that I was stronger than I believed, capable of standing up to those who sought to diminish me. Most importantly, it reaffirmed my belief that I deserved better, a life free from toxicity, manipulation, and fear. The betrayal from my mother was the final blow, a devastating culmination of years of neglect, favoritism, and emotional manipulation. It wasn't just her silence or indifference this time. It was an outright declaration of rejection, a verbal dagger that pierced deeper than anything I had experienced before. And when she chose to side with Ben in their latest scheme, it became clear that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be enough for her. It all came to a head during one particularly heated argument. After weeks of relentless pressure texts, calls, and guilt trips from family members, I finally confronted my mother about her blatant bias toward Ben. I reminded her of everything he had done to me as a child, the bullying, the destruction of my belongings, the constant belittling. I told her how his behavior had shaped me into someone who doubted her worth, someone who carried the scars of abandonment and neglect. But instead of acknowledging any of it, she dismissed my pain with a coldness that chilled me to the bone. "You've always been difficult," she snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. "I never asked for a daughter like you." Her words hit me like a freight train. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to spin as the weight of her statement crushed me. She didn't just dislike me, she regretted having me. All those years of feeling invisible suddenly made sense. Every missed soccer game, every ignored plea for help, every cruel comparison to my father wasn't just negligence. It was rejection, pure and simple. My own mother wished I didn't exist. But the cruelty didn't stop there. When Ben realized I wasn't budging on letting him move into my house, he and my mother concocted a plan so manipulative it left me questioning whether they saw me as human at all. They claimed Adeline, Ben's young daughter, was gravely ill. According to them, she needed immediate medical attention, but they couldn't afford the treatment because of their dire financial situation. The story unfolded over text messages and phone calls, each detail carefully designed to tug at my heartstrings. Photos of Adeline looking pale and frail began circulating among our extended family, accompanied by captions urging everyone to pray for her recovery. At first, I hesitated. Despite everything, the thought of a child suffering tugged at something primal within me. Wasn't it my responsibility to step up, to put aside old wounds for the sake of an innocent life? I wrestled with guilt, torn between protecting myself and doing what felt morally right. But something about the narrative didn't sit well with me. Why hadn't anyone mentioned Adeline's illness earlier? Why were these updates coming only after I refused to let Ben stay? Determined to uncover the truth, I reached out to mutual acquaintances under the guise of checking on Adeline's condition. What I discovered shattered whatever lingering hope I had that my mother and Ben might still possess a shred of decency. Adeline wasn't sick, not even remotely. She had been perfectly healthy, attending school and playing outside like any other child. The entire story was fabricated, a calculated ploy to exploit my empathy and force me into submission. When I confronted my mother about the lie, her response was predictably defensive. "You're twisting things again," she accused, her tone dripping with disdain. "We were only trying to make you see reason. If you cared even a little, you'd understand." "Understand?" I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. "You lied to me. You used your granddaughter, a child, as a pawn in your game. How could you possibly justify that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she hung up, leaving me to process the magnitude of her betrayal alone. That night, I cried until my throat burned and my eyes swelled shut. I felt like a fool for ever believing they might change, for hoping that somewhere deep down, they cared about me. But now, I knew the truth. I was nothing more than a means to an end, a resource to be exploited whenever convenient. In retaliation for my refusal to comply, my mother took her grievances public. One morning, I woke up to find my social media flooded with notifications. She had posted an old photo of me as a child, smiling innocently beside her, with a caption that read, "Some people forget where they came from." Family is everything, but gratitude seems to be in short supply these days. The post quickly gained traction, with relatives and acquaintances chiming in to condemn me. Comments poured in accusing me of being selfish, ungrateful, and heartless. Some even went so far as to call me a disgrace to the family name. For days, I avoided logging onto my accounts, unable to face the wave of judgment crashing over me. Friends who once supported me grew distant, unsure of which side to take. Strangers weighed in with unsolicited advice, telling me to forgive and forget or put family first. The irony stung. These were the same people who had turned a blind eye to my struggles growing up, who had watched silently as Ben tormented me and my mother neglected me. Now, they stood united against me, weaponizing morality to shame me into compliance. The isolation was suffocating. For the first time in years, I considered giving in, if only to escape the relentless scrutiny. But then I remembered why I had drawn the line in the first place. This wasn't about me being selfish or ungrateful. It was about protecting myself from a toxic cycle of manipulation and abuse. My mother and Ben weren't seeking reconciliation, they were seeking control. And I refused to surrender my autonomy, no matter the cost. With newfound resolve, I addressed the backlash head-on. I wrote a lengthy post explaining the truth, the years of mistreatment, the lies, and the deliberate attempts to guilt-trip me. I included screenshots of texts and evidence proving Adeline's fabricated illness. Though I knew not everyone would believe me, I owed it to myself to speak my truth. To my surprise, some friends and acquaintances reached out privately to offer support, admitting they had suspected foul play all along. Their validation gave me strength, reinforcing my decision to stand firm. Still, the fallout lingered. My relationship with my mother deteriorated beyond repair. She continued to smear my reputation online, painting herself as the victim and me as the villain. Extended family members distanced themselves, unwilling to challenge her narrative. But amidst the chaos, I found clarity. I realized that true family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. And if standing up for myself meant losing those who failed to provide either, then perhaps it was a loss worth enduring. The realization hit me like a thunderclap on a stormy night, sharp, deafening, and impossible to ignore. After years of enduring neglect, manipulation, and outright cruelty at the hands of those who were supposed to love me unconditionally, I finally understood that continuing down this path would only lead to one inevitable outcome: losing myself entirely. Every concession I had made, every boundary I had allowed to be crossed, had chipped away at my sense of self until there was barely anything left. But no more. I resolved then and there that I would no longer let anyone exploit my kindness, not even blood relatives. If standing firm meant being labeled as selfish or heartless, so be it. My peace was worth far more than their approval. Every concession I had made, every boundary I had allowed to be crossed, had chipped away at my sense of self until there was barely anything left. But no more. I resolved then and there that I would no longer let anyone exploit my kindness, not even blood relatives. If standing firm meant being labeled as selfish or heartless, so be it. My peace was worth far more than their approval. At first, I dismissed it as nothing. Perhaps the wind had nudged something loose, but deep down, I knew better. Ever since installing the security cameras after the egging incident, I had become hyper-aware of any unusual sounds around the house. Something about the night felt off. I crept toward the kitchen, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. The faint glow of the security monitor beckoned me, and with trembling fingers, I tapped the screen to check the live feed. What I saw made my blood run cold. There he was, Ben, hunched over the back door, attempting to jimmy the lock open with a crowbar. His face was twisted with frustration, sweat glistening under the dim porch light. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I was witnessing. Was he really trying to break into my home? Had he sunk so low? Anger surged through me, hot and electric, overriding the fear that had momentarily paralyzed me. This wasn't just an invasion of my space, it was an assault on my autonomy, a blatant disregard for the boundaries I had painstakingly set. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "There's someone trying to break into my house," I said, providing the address while keeping my eyes glued to the monitor. As I spoke, I noticed Ben pause, glancing over his shoulder as if sensing he was being watched. He muttered something under his breath before resuming his efforts, oblivious to the fact that his every move was being recorded. When the police arrived minutes later, sirens blaring and lights flashing, Ben still hadn't managed to force the door open. By then, I had already gathered the footage from the camera system, ensuring I had irrefutable evidence of his actions. The officers approached cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they called out for him to step away from the door. Ben complied reluctantly, his hands raised in mock surrender as he sneered at them. "What's going on here?" he demanded, feigning innocence. "She's making a big deal out of nothing." But the truth spoke louder than his lies. When the officers reviewed the footage I provided, their expressions hardened. They informed Ben that breaking and entering even an attempted act was a serious offense. He tried to argue, of course, claiming he was only checking on the property because he was concerned about its safety. But the video clearly showed otherwise. In the end, they escorted him away, warning him not to return or risk arrest. Watching him leave, handcuffed and humiliated, filled me with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Satisfaction because justice had been served, and sorrow because it had come to this, a brother reduced to a criminal trespasser by his own greed and desperation. The aftermath of that night solidified my decision to sever ties completely. Friends and acquaintances continued to weigh in, some siding with Ben and accusing me of overreacting, while others quietly supported my choice to prioritize my well-being. Social media became a battleground, with extended family members posting cryptic messages hinting at betrayal and ingratitude. One particularly scathing comment read, "Family should always come first, but some people forget where they came from." The irony stung. I had spent my entire life trying to survive within a family that had repeatedly cast me aside. Despite the backlash, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. Building a life independent of their influence was daunting, but it was also liberating. Each day brought new challenges, learning to navigate loneliness, dealing with judgmental stares at family gatherings I chose to skip, and grappling with the guilt society often heaps on women who dare to prioritize themselves. Yet, amidst the struggles, there were moments of triumph. Decorating my grandparents' old house with pieces that reflected my personality gave me a renewed sense of ownership. Volunteering at local shelters reminded me that true connection comes not from bloodlines but from shared humanity. And each morning I woke up in a space free from toxicity reaffirmed my belief that I deserved better. Looking back, I realize how much I've grown. The girl who once craved validation from her mother and acceptance from her brother is gone. In her place stands a woman who knows her worth and refuses to compromise it for anyone. Ben's intrusion and the subsequent fallout taught me that boundaries aren't just lines drawn in the sand. They're lifelines, protecting us from drowning in other people's expectations and demands. Without them, we lose ourselves. Though the journey hasn't been easy, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Loneliness may linger, and societal pressures may persist, but I've discovered something far more valuable: inner strength. It's quiet, unassuming, and resilient, a flame that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how fiercely the winds blow against it. And though I may never fully escape the shadows of my past, I've learned to walk alongside them without letting them define me. In the end, I've come to understand that family isn't defined by DNA but by mutual respect and care. Those who truly love you will honor your boundaries, celebrate your victories, and support you during your darkest hours. Everyone else, they're merely passengers on a train you've already disembarked from. And as the conductor of my own life, I'm steering toward a destination where I can thrive, not survive. In the end, I've come to understand that family isn't defined by DNA but by mutual respect and care. Those who truly love you will honor your boundaries, celebrate your victories, and support you during your darkest hours. Everyone else, they're merely passengers on a train you've already disembarked from. And as the conductor of my own life, I'm steering toward a destination where I can thrive, not survive. It all began when Ben and my mother escalated their campaign against me in the most public way possible: social media. They posted old photos of me as a child alongside captions dripping with insinuation, painting me as an ungrateful daughter and sister. Family should always come first, one post read, subtly implying that I had abandoned them. Comments poured in, many fueled by half-truths and baseless accusations. For days, it felt like the entire online world was judging me, dissecting my life without knowing the full story. Friends stopped responding to my messages, acquaintances whispered behind my back, and I was left feeling more isolated than ever. But then something remarkable happened. A former colleague of mine, Sarah, reached out privately after seeing the posts. She reminded me of how she'd witnessed firsthand the dynamics between me and my family during our time working together. "You don't deserve this," she said firmly. Her words were simple but carried immense weight. Encouraged by her support, I decided to share my side of the story not just with her, but publicly. I wrote a detailed post explaining the years of neglect, emotional abuse, and exploitation I endured. I included screenshots of threatening messages from Ben, evidence of his attempts to break into my home, and accounts of my mother's blatant favoritism. It wasn't easy to lay bare my vulnerabilities, but I knew silence would only perpetuate their narrative. To my surprise, the response was overwhelming. While some clung to their biases, many others began questioning the version of events presented by Ben and my mother. One particularly pivotal moment came when a mutual acquaintance commented on my post, confirming that they too had seen Ben's bullying behavior growing up. "I remember how he treated her," they wrote. "This isn't about family, it's about control." Slowly but surely, the tide turned. People started sharing my posts, amplifying my voice, and exposing the truth. Even those who initially doubted me began to see the cracks in Ben and my mother's facade. Despite the growing support, the backlash wasn't over yet. Ben retaliated by creating fake accounts to harass me further, flooding my inbox with hateful messages. My mother joined in, accusing me of fabricating stories to tarnish their reputation. The stress became unbearable, sleep eluded me, and paranoia crept into every corner of my mind. But this time, I wasn't alone. Sarah rallied a group of trusted friends and colleagues to monitor my social media and report abusive content. Together, we built a shield around me, ensuring that no amount of vitriol could penetrate my newfound resolve. Still, living under constant threat took its toll. Every creak of the floorboards, every unfamiliar car parked outside my house, sent my heart racing. I realized that staying in the same city meant remaining within their reach, a risk I couldn't afford to take. With the encouragement of my newfound allies, I made the bold decision to start fresh elsewhere. Moving wasn't just about escaping Ben and my mother. It was about reclaiming my life, finding a place where I could breathe freely without looking over my shoulder. The move itself was daunting. Packing up my belongings felt like closing a chapter of my life, one filled with pain, betrayal, and resilience. As I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, tears streamed down my face. But amidst the sadness, there was also hope. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future untethered from the toxicity of my past. Settling into a new city brought challenges, but also opportunities. I rented a cozy apartment downtown, decorated it with pieces that reflected my personality, and slowly began building routines that centered around self-care and growth. At work, I connected with colleagues who appreciated me not for what I could do for them, but for who I was. One evening, during a team dinner, I opened up about my struggles. Instead of judgment, I received empathy and understanding. Their kindness reinforced my belief that true connections are built on mutual respect and authenticity. Outside of work, I joined local community groups, a book club, a volunteer organization, and a hiking group. These spaces introduced me to people who celebrated individuality and valued honesty. There was Emma, a fellow hiker whose infectious laughter brightened even the gloomiest trails. Mark, a writer who encouraged me to journal my thoughts. And Lisa, a teacher who reminded me daily that I deserved love and happiness. With each passing day, I felt the weight of my past lifting, replaced by a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced since childhood. Of course, moving didn't erase the scars entirely. Some nights, memories of Ben's taunts or my mother's dismissive remarks would creep into my dreams, leaving me restless and uneasy. But now, instead of bottling up my emotions, I leaned on my support system. Whether it was venting to Sarah over video calls or journaling late into the night, I learned to confront my pain rather than suppress it. Therapy played a crucial role in this process, helping me unpack years of trauma and rebuild my sense of self-worth. As months passed, updates from my old life trickled in sporadically. Rumor had it that Ben's attempts to smear my name online had backfired spectacularly. Several commenters exposed inconsistencies in his stories, pointing out how his claims contradicted documented facts. Meanwhile, my mother's posts grew increasingly desperate, garnering fewer likes and shares. It seemed that the digital court of public opinion had rendered its verdict and it wasn't in their favor. In my new city, I thrived. I pursued hobbies I'd long neglected, explored hidden gems in the area, and forged friendships rooted in trust and admiration. One particularly poignant moment occurred during a charity event where I volunteered. A young girl approached me, shyly thanking me for organizing the fundraiser. "You're so brave," she said softly. Her words struck a chord deep within me. Brave me. For so long, I'd viewed myself as a victim, someone defined by her circumstances. Yet here was this child, seeing strength where I once saw weakness. Looking back, I realized that my journey wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. The girl who once craved validation from her mother and acceptance from her brother evolved into a woman confident in her worth. Ben and my mother may have tried to define me, but ultimately, they failed. In standing firm against their manipulation, I discovered a reservoir of inner strength I never knew existed. And though the road ahead remains uncertain, I face it with courage, knowing that I am surrounded by people who genuinely care.